Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Conspiracy Theories, Social Media, and Fake News panel, which is the first winter semester event of the Sophia Society. For those of you who don't know us, the Sophia Society is a group of Tyndale students committed to stimulating interdisciplinary dialogue about topics that bring academia and faith together. So that typically takes the form of panels such as the one that we are going to have tonight. So I am here with my co-host, Rafael Sakarya, as well as 4 Tyndale professors. to act as our panel today. So Rafael, would you please introduce us to them?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jasmine. By no means is this an exhaustive list of our panelists and their accomplishments and backgrounds, but tonight we have with us Dr. Heather Birch, Director of the Bachelor of Education program, Dr. Paul Franks, Associate Professor of Philosophy, Dr. Cyril Guerette, Assistant Professor of Biblical Studies and Theology, and Dr. Nancy Ross, Associate Professor of Psychology, all here at Tyndale University.
Wonderful. I am looking so forward to hearing what all of you have to say about our topic tonight. But before we get into the discussion, some of you might be looking at the event title and thinking, wow, there's a lot of big topics here. So what is our angle? What's kind of our general approach? And in putting this panel together, the Sophia Society really wanted this to kind of become a conversational resource, a kind of toolbox for students and non-students alike to be able to refer back to in equipping themselves to navigate the information age, to make decisions about what they believe and what they don't believe. Because the reality is, every time we encounter any kind of piece of information, whether it's an account of an event from a friend, or a piece of news, or even just an image, visual information, we have a decision to make to either accept that thing as true or reject it as false. And for different people, there's different factors that play into those decisions. But now we're living in an age where the supplementary information that we consult to kind of help make these decisions is virtually infinite. So where do we start? How do we even go about deciding what we believe? And those are the kinds of questions that we're seeking to answer tonight. So Raf, would you please take it away with our first?
Yeah, absolutely. So we live, as Jasmine said, in a saturated information era, for lack of better words, let's say. But maybe before we even want to start discussing about how we choose our information and select it as true or false, maybe we want to quickly discuss the importance of seeking truth as the means, as the ends to our means in our pursuit on how to make these decisions. So yeah, tonight we're going to be engaging in a process of exactly that, of how to discover truth and untruth. And maybe before we start, the panelists can share their thoughts on why that is important to seek truth in our decisions and judgments.
So how about we start with Dr. Franks?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think as Christians, this is a question that may be a little bit easier to answer, in that if you have a conception that all things are of God, right? That God is the Lord of all, He's the creator of all. Then, as we learn more about reality, as we learn more about His creation, we learn more about Him. And so, why is truth important? Well, the more acquainted we are with truth, the more acquainted we are with God. And that seems like a pretty good motivator. And I guess the other sort of thing is, like, who wants to walk around defending things that are false? Like, that's no fun, And so, like, truth helps you get errors out of your system, and then you can move on and worry about defending things that are true. And so, I think both of those could contribute to the importance of a topic like this, in that pursuit of truth.
Very nice. Anybody have anything to add to that?
I would just throw on there, my ontology, we one of participation. So I do believe, like Dr. Frank said, that we can participate in the truth of God. And so we have a chance to, when we speak, our speech can actually be flavored with truth and also with beauty, which God is both, and goodness, which can act. And so the use of our language is really important, that we align it with God. And as we do so, we're aligning ourselves with God, and we're actually participating, I think, in a certain sense, in the divine nature. We can get into deeper what that means. There's a lot of caveats to that, but yeah, that would be part of my own philosophical stance of my ontology.
Mm-hmm.
I'd just add, from the perspective of a social scientist, I see the world as God's creation. You've alluded to this already, I think, Paul and Cyril, that the world is God's creation, and the more we know it, the more we know Him. And also, as a scientist, I think we like to be able to have a sense of the world being predictable. Like,
Hmm.
if I understand how things work, I can predict the better choice to make, and things will work out for me if I follow the truth. And so, in a very practical sense, truth is extremely valuable in that way.
And I'll just add that as a person who studies schooling and education, my mind first goes to the responsibility of a teacher to help their students reach truth, reach the right knowledge. When a student leaves you, you want them to know something, and to know something that is true and right.
Very true.
Yeah, those are wonderful points. It reminds me of when Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." And I feel like this endeavor that we're engaging in is partly a way of seeking Christ. So I think that's great. But I will jump into the first question now. So we live in the information era, and information is at our fingertips, everywhere, in front of our eyes, all over the place. And we need to make decisions every day, every second, because the information we get, it affects our thoughts and beliefs and eventually our actions. So we need to have a good method of going about that. But what are some of the challenges and barriers that people face when trying to find a reliable information on topics, and why are they challenges and barriers?
I'll be happy to jump in on that one.
Yeah, please do.
Talking a little bit about some of the cognitive biases that we generally have. So, one of the biases we talk about in Intro to Psych is the tendency to be overconfident. So, most of us are more sure of what we think we know than we should be. Pretty much all of us. Okay, most of the time. So it's a really good idea to approach the world with the expectation that you could be wrong, because our natural instinct isn't to think that. So that's one thing to keep in mind. We also have some other tendencies. We have a tendency to project meaning on random events sometimes. So we see something as being meaningful when really it's just a random outcome that surprised us because of how things fell together. Or my personal favorite bias is the self-serving bias. We tend to think we're smarter or more perceptive or better than others. We even think we have the smartest animals. So like my dogs are smarter than yours, I'm sure. And so these biases, they set us off kind of in a risky direction.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. One of the things I was thinking of was just that when you're thinking about the amount of information, and it can kind of be overwhelming, and just there's so much there. And so sort of I guess it's not perfect, but it's a sort of a first step, a kind of a heuristic to use whenever you're looking at that, is to sort of ask yourself, whenever you have all of these sources of information, especially online, ask a very basic question, like, what's this place's revenue model? Like, are they trying to just generate clicks because that's how they get revenue? And so like, we're all in different places, but as I've sort of gone through things, I try to actually find places that I respect, that actually just charge for like a membership, and that way there's not as much of an incentive for. So in a less than there's a group at it's called The Athletic. Then they do like sports reporting and stuff, and I pay a yearly fee for an athletic membership, and the articles have a different flavor than just on a regular site where they're clearly trying to get you to click it because that's how they drive their revenue. And so I think that can be sort of like, if you see there's always certain kinds of websites that always have certain kinds of stories, that's a clue that maybe they've realized that publishing those kinds of stories is a good or a good avenue for generating revenue. And so just be aware that they may not be concerned about the pursuit of truth, but about satisfying the shareholders and things like that. And so I think it's something to at least have in the back of your mind when there's so much of it coming from so many different directions. Just pause and ask yourself, like, why are they doing what they're doing? What is driving it? And for some of them, I think you'll pretty quickly see, they're about the revenue. And then you should take that into consideration as you assess the information they're providing.
Yeah. Back on that. Because I do think you're right. We have to follow the money. It's very helpful. And I think this is also one of the problems we come up with is that we mistrust media. And part of that is because of the ad revenue. So when you see CNN, MSNBC are making all this money from Pfizer, you're like, okay.
Yeah.
You have the same CEOs that are
Right.
connected, or you have board members on both, and so you start asking questions. And another example would be with the Epstein story and the stuff that came out with what was going on with Prince Andrew 17 years ago, and MNSPC, I think it was like 5 years ago. They had a woman who was speaking about a reporter who was saying, I had the whole story. I was going to get out, but then I got it cut basically because it was more profitable to tell stories about the Queen, and they wouldn't have access to the Queen anymore if they did this story.
Wow.
So you definitely, the revenue, I think, is Dr. Franks is right on. We have to kind of watch out both for alternative like click mongering, but also for the organizations as well.
Yeah, so it's not that revenue for these sites itself is a barrier to discerning truth. It's that it introduces another level of ambiguity, I think, and cynicism that you're like, okay, this is something else I need to wade through, and that can be very time consuming.
I'm Mr. Free Market Economy guy. You're not going to hear me complaining about people wanting to make a profit for their efforts. Like, I'm all for that. It's just, you just have to be mindful of it and how you weigh and assess the sorts of things that you see. That was the point I was trying to make.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think the bias goes with that too. Like, so I make sure when I'm reading, I purposely, when I get American news, I read CNN article on it, and then I read a Fox one, and you see the difference right away because of who they're going to talk to, and you're to be the Toronto Star and the National Post, right? You immediately see a difference because of their audience, and so revenue has a little bit to do that, but also just the kind of political bias as well is something. So it makes us all kind of, like you said, Jasmine, a little bit wary. Because where's this coming from? And I think, just like Dr. Frank said, keep your eyes open to it and kind of be ready for it and filter it through those lenses.
Yeah, as Dr. Ross said, like on some of her points, we'll need to exercise a little bit of skepticism and be aware of our biases. And of course, there's a bad side. There's a too far to that as well, which we will get to and we'll discuss as well. Yeah. And to your point, Dr. Franks, maybe is free we need to be careful of free information, because anybody could, it's free. So we have to see how to eliminate that kind of bias that might be written in those things or get that money side out of it. So maybe, do we want to talk about, oh goodness, I'm blanking right now.
That's all right. I can take it away if you'd like. Something I was curious about is, so we have those kinds of, pre-existing factors, right? We have biases, our own internal biases to be concerned about. Maybe we even have kind of previous educational structures that have kind of contributed to those, or maybe a lack of training and being able to evaluate certain things. We have philosophical things, we have theological, all of these different factors that create barriers, but do those change when the topic that we're trying to find reliable information on is like a hot topic, or one that sells, or one that's just really in the conversations of everybody? Like, how does that change our situation coming into this information landscape?
Here's what Dr. Ross would say. That sounds like a good question for you.
I was just going to jump in there. I think one of the things that we have to watch out for is that it's really easy to get your beliefs a little bit too closely associated with your identity. And I'm not necessarily talking about your belief in God. I definitely affirm having your sense of your identity being Christian. That's not a bad thing. But when you are too attached to all of your beliefs, so none of them are questionable, then things get really intense, and it's very hard to be rational about things. It's hard to have a civilized conversation with someone about things. So whichever side you're coming from, whether you're talking about what you believe about vaccines, or what you believe about freedom, or what you believe about gun control, so when things are hot topics, we do tend to get very passionate. Things get a little bit more inflamed. And it's actually a lot harder to have a good conversation about it with anyone other than those who agree with us.
Right. It's very high stakes.
Yeah,
very
which is what you
polarizing.
see in like social media, right? Most people's social media profiles end up curing out, like calling out those who disagree with you, and then everybody has their own little echo chambers, and they just reinforce each other's ideas, and there's very little interaction with those, with whom you disagree. And then, and so then one of the things I love is, so I'm American, and so I'm basically like, try to stay up to date with what things are going on back home, and like the day of Justice Breyer's announcing that he's going to retire from the Supreme Court, like everybody on Twitter was an expert on the Supreme Court nomination process and all of those sorts of things. And, and then we've seen all of the experts about, vaccinations and, masking policies. Everybody's an expert on everything. But it's easy to have that mindset whenever you sort of, you identify so closely. And whenever you identify yourself, like Dr. Ross was mentioning, I think becomes easier to sort of push away or to ignore those who make you feel uncomfortable, because in a sense they're questioning your identity. But then that creates more and more of that echo chamber. And one of the things I love about teaching at Tyndale is that there is such a diverse student body and diverse faculty, diverse staff. Even in like just in terms of like we're united in Christ, but there's a lot of theological difference there. And so what it kind of forces those conversations, because you can't just say, well, I'm Pentecostal, I'm only going to take the classes with the Pentecostals and ignore everybody else. You can't do that at a place like Tyndale, right? And so you're always mixing and interacting. And I think that kind of helps create a little bit of distance where you realize there's people who, I like and I have lunch with, but they have a different theological view and they're okay. And it kind of can create some of that distance, which I think is great. It's one of the things I love about Tyndale and sort of the environment that we have here is it encourages that kind of discussion.
Yeah, for sure. Dr. Birch, do you have anything to add on this topic before we kind of move a little bit forward in the conversation?
Sure. So if it's okay, Dr. Ross, I'm going to mention a psychological theory that is about learning and that helps us understand, like, why are people willing to learn certain things and why do they want to learn certain things and why do they not want to learn other things? And it's related to this idea of identity in the sense that we all have a deep need for relatedness in this. But it doesn't have to be relatedness like actual physical face-to-face interactions with people. It can be relatedness with any group that we want to be a part of or are a part of. So it can be aspirational or it can be literal. And so if I perceive that some group that I want to be a part of knows something or has a skill or learns about that thing, then I am motivated to learn about that thing. And this can be really positive because I was in a conversation with someone on this call and someone that I identify with in terms of my identity group, and that being university professor. And the person had a skill, was showing me knowledge they had. As soon as I hung up, I started practicing that skill because I was so motivated to have that same skill. And I mean, that's a person, that's Dr. Ross. And, like I see her in person, I interact with her, but like, like a community on Reddit can also have this impact on people, or like an affinity space online where people are interacting. And it's the idea that if someone I look up to, if I think they would learn that or they would have that idea, then I would also like to have that idea, to be related to them. It doesn't have to be conversations, but just I want to be like them. And so I think this compounds some of the biases that Nancy was talking about. And one of them is, I'll add another one, the illusory truth bias, which is when you hear something repeated a number of times, you're more likely to believe that is now true. And if it's repeated by people in your group, that your relatedness group, it's compounded even more. You are faster going to believe that.
Great psychology there. I love it.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's really helpful.
That's actually crazy. I feel like I'm in a much worse starting point for making decisions than I thought I was, which is probably a good thing. We're kind of sobering the self-reflection here. So that's really good. But let's kind of focus in on kind of the part of information, like the information landscape, where we see the greatest spread in opinions and in how people judge things. And that's typically in the area of conspiracy theories, or really big items of fake news or whatever that then turn into conspiracy theories. We can talk a lot about that. So first, maybe let's ask Dr. Franks, because we had spoken about this earlier.
Yeah.
What is a conspiracy theory?
Yeah, well, I suspect that if you asked, 5 different people, you'd get 6 different answers. And so, we'll like, this is a definition that I've sort of familiar with and from another context, and it's from the philosopher by the name of Brian Keeley. So I just made a note of this, and then we'll sort of work our way through it. And then I will just kind of say what I think is the most important aspect of this that I think is probably would be common across definitions of conspiracy theories. So Brian Keeley defines a conspiracy theory like this. He says it's a proposed explanation of some historical event or events in terms of the significant causal agency of a relatively small group of people acting in secret. Right. So that small group is the conspirators, right? That's the conspiracy theory. So it's a theory again. Yeah, sure. So it's a proposed explanation of some event in terms of significant agency or causal agency of a small group of people acting in secret. So there's kind of 3 main components. It's explaining something, right? Or the appearance of something. There's a group of conspirators that are the cause of the explanation. Like they're the ones that's bringing about, and that group is small and acting in secret. Now, what I like about his definition is that it's neutral between, like, sometimes if you ever have, somebody who's like they have their favorite conspiracy theory and you're talking about it and they'll say, but some conspiracy theories are true. And I think we have to say, yeah, that's right. There are some conspiracy theories are true. Like Watergate is a famous example, right? That was there was actually a conspiracy there to cover things up. And so that definition is neutral between what later he calls warranted conspiracy theories and unwarranted conspiracy theories. And so I think whenever we are having conversations about conspiratorial thinking, the kind that most of us are probably, either concerned about or interested in. I mean, they're always fascinating whenever you read about these things, and, is probably the unwarranted kind. And so it can be useful about trying to tease out what is it that makes a conspiracy theory or justified, you could say, like what makes one like a reasonable conspiracy theory versus not. And there's probably even more debate about that question. But I think that may be enough just to kind of get something on the table, that there are some components to it that you would find true. And I think the key is that there's a small group of conspirators acting in secret, right? If it's, the entire US government doing something can't be a conspiracy theory. There's too many people involved, right? It's got to be like a subset of those, a small group of the US government doing something, right? So it's got to be in secret. And if you lose that aspect of it, you sort of lose the conspiracy part of it, right? And so there's some key things there that I think are at least useful. Now, like I said, I don't know if this is a perfect definition, and so I'd love to hear from some of the other panelists if there are aspects that they think are missing, because I've yet to, every time I go through this, I've yet to figure out what it is that I don't like about the definition, but there's something I don't like about it. I just don't know what it is yet. And so maybe some of you guys can help me figure out what's missing or what's overstated or what's incorrect or something like that. Maybe you guys can give me an assist on that.
I jump in. That small is an interesting point, and how big can it be before it's not a conspiracy? For example, I forever, just whenever we're using internet and you have your cameras and stuff, I was always like, they're recording that, they're watching, and people were like, that they would never do that, they couldn't do that, and I was like, no, it's happening. Eventually, we get secret pictures of Zuckerberg with tape over his camera. Yeah. And then all of a sudden, Snowden tells us, oh yeah, the CIA has been copying all this stuff. It's running through PRISM program. This has been happening for a decade. Well, was that a conspiracy or not? Like, I was called a conspiracy theorist for talking about that, and then all of a sudden it's becoming true, right? So yeah, I think it was a great point you made about warranted, because there are, like, the Gulf of Tonkin started the Vietnam War. Guy Fawkes, you have the Iraq War started under false pretenses. You have MK Ultra was actually a mind control experiment happening in Canada, which our government, Adrian Clarkson, actually has a whole special on CBC about. You have, the Tuskegee study on black males, where they're injecting them with syphilis. You have, like, children in government were being sent to pedophiles on purpose in Germany. Like, this is all documented stuff that's happening where people know about it. So how big or small it is, I think, but this, I love that you said that, because this is the reason people start running with it. As soon as you start seeing this stuff, but this stuff gets held back. And then it's called the Streisand effect, right? Where I would say like, lack of giving information is a form of misinformation. So when you don't share stuff, all of a sudden a guy's Googling on Google, he says, oh, Pfizer fraud. Right. Oh, in 2009, they had a $2.3 billion fine for fraud like that. Oh, and then they like, oh, they're hiding this from me. Right. You know, then they where do you go with that? So I think that's a good question about how big does it have to be or small it has to be. I do agree, like the most conspiracy theories, you end up with this like little cabal who's like running the world or whatever, right? So, but
that's at least makes for the best movies.
Yeah.
Right.
For example, we actually had the CIA collecting this information for a long time. So I don't know that it's. I wonder about that, like how big is too big or too small? But that's where I love the rest of the definition.
I actually wondered about that small as well, because on the one hand, Paul, I agree with you. If you suppose that there's a whole lot of people involved, then how would that ever be kept secret?
Yeah.
But that's a very rational thought, which doesn't necessarily always mean people don't believe this thing. So I'm aware, for example, of a colleague at another institution who's dealing with an entire community where a good half of the community believes COVID is a hoax, like altogether a hoax.
Yeah.
And
like doesn't exist.
Yeah, that it's kind of all made up just to scare us into doing things. And so they're believing a lot of people are in on this somehow, you know? Yeah. And so, yeah, I don't know that it's always, so that would that not be a conspiracy theory since they believe so many people are involved in it? I think it's still a conspiracy theory.
Yeah, that's helpful. Like, yeah, I like how you're saying like it's a reasonable like thing to include about a conspiracy theory, but that doesn't mean it's going to be convincing to somebody who you're trying to help reason through some of these things. And
right.
Yeah, but I definitely think the smallness and the secrecy part are really connected, because like
how do you keep it secret?
Like Watergate now we wouldn't say is a conspiracy theory. Like it's not a secret anymore, right? And so it's out in the open. We know these things, and some of the other things that Dr. Guerette mentioned, we know these things, and so they're not. So that secrecy part seems to be important. Or the other part that I think is I wasn't in the definition, but I think may fall into the maybe not always in the unwarranted ones, is that there's like some sort of a sinister motive behind it. You know, I don't know any popular conspiracy theories that are driven out of, seeking the good of others. And so I'm going to secretly put money in their accounts or something like that. Nobody calls that a conspiracy theory. So that's at least going to be part of it. But then again, you run into the thing where there are true conspiracy theories that were motivated by malice. And then there's, how do you distinguish between the justified ones and the unjustified ones, or the ones that are reasonable to wonder about, and then the ones that are sort of beyond sort of your reach epistemically, that too much is there. And so maybe that's something we can try and reason through it as we go on tonight.
I'd love to jump in on that, because I think that, first of all, conspiracy is like, you go to jail for conspiracy. Like it's an actual crime. Like you go to conspiracy, you're in jail. Like that's real stuff, right? Right now, the media would say that there was a conspiracy on January 6th to overthrow the government. That's a really popular conspiracy theory. Is it? You could say right now I'm hearing a lot about Putin is going to cause false flags in Ukraine. That word false flag is usually a conspiracy theory word, which means to fake something to start a war. Well, we're hearing now that Putin's going to do that. And so it's very interesting to me what gets labeled a conspiracy theory and what doesn't, or what's a reasonable one or what isn't, and who gets to control that narrative. And that's why you have so many people pushing back, because they're saying, we're not even allowed to have this dialogue. You just get labeled something. And so what is it, reasonable or unreasonable? And what starts to happen is once you withhold information, when people start to say, I think maybe the media is lying to me, then they start going deeper, and then you can go into a hole, right? And all of a sudden millions or the people are eating babies, and that's what happened. So we have to be, I think that's one of the part, I think as a society, I want to be more transparent and talk about, like, media is supposed to actually not take biases. Like I shouldn't see that much of a difference between a CNN and Fox. Like I should be hearing facts, and what we're hearing now is there's narratives that are coming in. So then you mistrust the narrative, or you only trust the one narrative. And then all of a sudden you're in those cycles that Dr. Birch is talking about.
You run into the situations where you got to go to the fact checker to check the fact checker, and then you're wondering, well, who's checking that fact checker? And then
I think it brings up a very important aspect of conspiracy theories, that in one way, that skepticism can be virtuous. It can be, like we were talking, like Dr. Ross mentioned, and Dr. Birch as well. It's healthy to kind of doubt our natural inclinations into what's true and what's not, and what we're being fed, because nobody wants to be gullible in the information that they're taking in. But then there's that flip side where, well, now we're in an infinite rabbit hole of skepticism, and we can't believe anything is true ever, and we don't trust anybody. So where is that kind of prevented? Or Raf, if you want to jump in on that, it looks like you want to.
Yeah. So I mean, I love, you guys have pointed out a bunch of things, and it just has birthed lots of stuff in my mind. But I think the word in your definition, well, not your definition, Dr. Frank's, but the definition that you presented, that stuck with me was secretive. And so it's like, what does it mean to be a secret? Does it mean that people don't know about it, or does it mean that the people involved don't know about it? Like there's an element of secrecy, but sometimes we know that there's things that are believed that are wide in the open, and they're still considered conspiracy. And so, at what point is it not a secret anymore? Does the media have to report on it, or does, that kind of thing? And then I think also it comes down to then, well, what makes something true? Like, at what point do we take the conspiracy label off of the conspiracy theory? Because, I mean, the media will start reporting about it, and people will still say no, and more people will start believing it, and a lot of people will still say no. And it's like, that becomes like a problem. So it would be interesting to dive in, like analyze those, or if there's anything on that. And lastly, I'll just say, I think the hardest thing for people to believe about conspiracy theories is the fact that the intention, like the motivation behind it, is usually far. You need to make a lot of steps, and then you get to, okay, well, why are they doing all of these things in that case? And sometimes they're wrong. Maybe the conspiracy proposer has that final piece wrong, but maybe a lot of the other things right, or maybe they don't, and it's hard to wrap your head around the fact that a person would do that kind of a thing. And maybe sometimes that's the case, and maybe sometimes it's just blown out of proportion. So I don't know if anybody wants to jump in on that or say something.
You made me think, and I think a good one we could talk about is pedophilia in the government. Right. This is something that it's a big, people will say QAnon, and they'll start going down these paths. I think we got mixed messages, and this is the hard thing, right? So people who have been victims of it have seen cover-ups, obviously the Vatican and such. People like, Epstein isn't powerful. He's hanging out with Bill Clinton. He's hanging out with Bill Gates. He's hanging out with Prince Andrew. So you have this happening. You also hear a lot about, we need to stop sex trafficking. This is the biggest industry. There's billions of dollars. So we know this is an actual phenomenon where there's this sex trafficking of children is a huge problem. But then we also hear, if you say something about it, it's somehow government related, then it's a conspiracy theory. And so it's obviously, I think what starts to happen is people are kind of going, okay, what? Obviously, there's got to be some powerful people, and we keep catching them. By the way, you could find lists of like thousands of people in both the Republican and the Democrat Party who are high levels who have been caught with this stuff. Right now, is this all organized? Well, we know there's some organized. Does it go the way to the top? There's one, Hillary Clinton is eating babies, and this is the problem. We got these phenomenon, and then we're like, well, this is all happening. Therefore, now everyone's suspect. Like every priest is a pedophile, every politician. That's going too far. But then when you try to shut it down and make fun of it, it's like, well, we know this is an actual phenomenon. There are powerful people who are, we've caught Epstein, we've caught a Nexium cult, which is a huge cult that shut down. So this is happening. But then you're kind of shut down and called a conspiracy theorist if you're kind of so how do you this is the tension. And I know I'm almost talking on behalf today, I'm kind of on behalf of the conspiracy theorists, because I'm almost like, why are people thinking this? It's not just they're idiots. This is through these questions. And we need to really think about the different narratives. And when things get shut down, again, a Streisand effect. People go dig deeper. As soon as you say you can't think this, then they're like, and then, but the problem is then they'll go too far down the rabbit hole. So how do we balance this? I think, Rafael, is kind of what you're asking. And I do think this is probably something that we need to really, especially in the university level, we need to really make part of, our education process and talk about these things. And hopefully this is a part of that.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's an excellent point. There has to come a point where we distinguish wisdom from just rampant skepticism, and rampant distrust, because, I think that the most troubling aspect of conspiracy theories is that they introduce the kind of a basis for mistrust in those authorities and those figures who we initially thought were trustworthy, right? So whether that's priests or the government or whatever, there's a level of, they're the expert. So yeah, I think that's a very good point. Sorry.
I wonder if I might jump in with
please,
with some thoughts that could perhaps help find a middle spot here between the two extremes. So, again, back to Intro to Psych, when we talk about how we know the things we know, I think we've talked about the word skepticism quite a bit, but they would qualify that skepticism a little bit. So kind of a curious skepticism. And so that's just not saying I doubt everything you say, so I can't trust you at all. It's like, I'm wondering how you know that. And so there's some good questions to ask that can help you get a clearer picture. Like how did they get to that conclusion? So what are they using to make that conclusion? Or what kind of data did they have? What are their sources? Those kinds of things. Another really good question to ask is, who is their comparison group? If they're making an inference about a particular group of people, who are they comparing them to when they make that conclusion? Because frequently people choose a comparison group that helps them make their story. And so by asking some of those kinds of questions, you're not saying, I don't believe you at all. But you're also not saying, oh, sure, I'll believe anything you say. You're trying to understand the basis for a claim. And that's not necessarily going to help us get to the bottom of news stories that we can't possibly have access to the truth about just now. But it will help us to approach things, I think, a little bit more healthily.
I think that's a fundamental element of critical reasonings, and something that stuck with me when I took that class with Dr. Franks. And I have next to me, and I'll just read you a quote, and it just says, "Your beliefs are yours only if you critically examine them for yourself and decide that they're supported by good reason." So I think you need to have that healthy skepticism that you're talking about. And sometimes we need to be aware, just the fact that we're aware of these, maybe my internet's cutting out, but being aware of these biases or that sort of thing is important in making those decisions. So and at the end of the day, it means that I like to say, when we're critical reasoners, everything is on the table until you have good reason not to believe it. And I think that's important at the end of the day, to not throw away something that might just sound incredibly out there, but at least go through the exercise and see why it's incredibly out there. And now you know why it is that is the case. But unless anybody else wants to jump in on that, I know where we could go next on this.
I would just quickly say, I do think you're right about, I see left-wing and right-wing conspiracy theories, right? The left wing is like the whole Russia thing that was Trump. Like we had it ended up not being well documented, at least, right? But then on the other hand, you have like, Michelle Obama is a man, or you have like, there's like, this is real stuff. So you have these two sides that they can both get into it, right? And then you have them in the middle who keep them all. So I like that. We got to be careful not to think only one side is capable of this, right? This is a human phenomenon.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no one has a corner on the market of strange theories. Like it's just
everywhere.
Yeah, and so which makes your task that much more difficult, because it's not like you can just say, "Oh, I'm going to go be part of that group," because that group will have people who are engaged in conspiracy theories too, or inclined towards this sort of conspiratorial thinking. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and we can that's a great segue into talking about why we're inclined to believe conspiracy theories, if we want to start to discuss about that.
Well, I'll just say, I think Dr. Ross picked up at least part of it earlier, kind of when in the very beginning, whenever she talked about we want to make sense of the world around us. And I mean, a conspiracy theory is a really powerful theory that does that, right? It takes you have some event that you want to have explained, and it explains that. And it explains a lot more as well, right? Like, I mean, and so it's really powerful. And one of the things that, sometimes people get uncomfortable with when trying to talk with somebody about a conspiracy theory that they've adopted is that it seems like no matter what evidence you provide to them that would disconfirm it, well, that evidence can actually just be folded into the conspiracy theory itself, right? And, that's what they would want you to say, or that's what they want you to believe, like you can just sort of fold it in. And so I think it's easier for a lot of people to think that there is a mastermind behind some of these terrible events than to think that just bad things happen, right? Or that you could have somebody who does something really terrible on their own, and it's almost sort of random. And like, I think a lot of things that people try to, like, I think it's easier to say the Chinese government intentionally introduced this COVID-19 to the world so that whatever their favorite explanation is, it's easier to kind of accept that than to think it either occurred naturally on its own or it was just an accident out of a lab. Either way, like it's easier it's easier to conceive of how we could spend 2.5 years now of dealing with all of this nonsense because of an accident. Like that's a hard reality that's a hard pill to swallow. And so it's easier to be like, oh yeah, somebody was behind it. They're trying to, reduce the global population, or they're trying to take over this or that, or whatever, the explanation is. And so I think that's part of it, is just, we want to make sense of reality. And so conspiracy theories help us do it.
Right. So we search for patterns the way that Dr. Ross was, sorry. Yes. The way that you said earlier.
Yes. And I'll just add to that too. We've been talking about how there are conspiracy theories on the left and the right, but there is a portion of our population that is more vulnerable to conspiracy theories. And that is people who are also otherwise oppressed in some way. So whether it's racial oppression or financial oppression or whatever it might be, these are people whose daily lives are impacted by something sort of unarticulated, something pervasive that everybody says isn't real. And, and so they already know from experience that can happen. And so therefore, they're looking for, how can I get ahead of the next thing before I suffer from it? So, and again, that's a human tendency. So any of us under that kind of oppression might then become more vulnerable to those kinds of ideas.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And if you look in the States, like if you compare the vaccination rates in the US and Canada, the US is way behind. But there's a group of people that are, pretty significantly less vaccinated than others. And that's African Americans in the States. Like, it's just, as a group, their rates aren't as high as others. And whenever you think about, earlier, Dr. Guerette mentioned the Tuskegee experiments and others, like, they have legitimate reasons to be like, yeah, you want me to do what? I don't know about that. Like, there's not that trust. And you have that sort of historical thing in the background that they're aware of. And there's also contemporary concerns about that they have, and it kind of combines together. They're like, they may be more inclined to accept a theory, or they just may be inclined to reject whatever it is that you're doing and not try and do it. But given that tendency that we have to want to explain things, you could see why people would be like, yeah, I'm not doing that. That's another example of, and then whatever it is that they have in their mind that they've had to deal with, in a way that others haven't. That's a really good point.
And to add to that, I think as Christians, there's another layer of that, which is we believe there's a conspirator in heaven who fought against God. He conspired against God. And he is actively roaming the earth, and he's creating systems of oppression. And he's
whoa.
So we some Christians backed away from that. They don't believe in a personal malevolent intelligence. I still have a traditional view. I believe in an actual, Satan and his minions. And so if you believe in that, and Jesus was offered the kingdom, Satan's basically, I have all these kingdoms under my control. Here they are if you want. Yeah. Whoa, now we have this whole other thing of like, there's this satanic influence. And so, and you know what, my theology still holds that there is this influence. However, I also have a theology that has, God is stronger, but it creates a real tension for us to go like, what does that work here? Oh, there's like, when you look at oppression, you're like, how are this many people dying of starvation? Like, that's diabolical. Is it just human malfeasance?
Right.
Yeah, partly, but is there also some structural, purposeful? And that's what I'm saying. So our theology as Christians, that's why Christians can be very easily part of this too. And I don't think it's all wrong. I think we have to kind of think that through, but we have to be really careful, because then we see a demon behind every rock. We see a demon, like, and so I think our demonology or our angelology starts to come in play here too. And how do we think about satanic influence, or is, and we don't want to give them too much power. You make them omnipotent, but then you can't turn them into nothing. And so we have this Christian theology also has this interesting conspiratorial sidebar that we have to address as well.
That's an excellent point. And I think, like, it's going back to what Dr. Birch said. What was that kind of phenomenon that you mentioned about how people kind of gravitate towards certain groups? What was that called?
Self-determination theory. Relatedness.
Okay. Right. Relatedness.
For relatedness.
Yes. Right. So thinking about that, I think that is one of those other things that kind of motivates where we kind of go, which of these groups, the hardcore skeptics, or the kind of, we're going to take a lighter, optimistic view of the world, which was more virtuous, which do you want to associate with? Like thinking of, my generation and postmodernism, and how like a hermeneutic of suspicion is kind of like, that's what's seen as virtuous. Like being suspicious is kind of the better place to err. And so that's where we end up going. But we've also noted that there is a place in the middle. There is a kind of a biblical wisdom, a biblical way of processing mass amounts of information. And that's either by withholding judgment, which is something that we can still do, or by working with these kinds of tools that we've been given, through our rational faculties to kind of arrive at certain decisions, even if we hold them tentatively. So maybe we could just have everybody kind of expand on that a little bit. What are, the tools that can better prepare people to engage that decision-making process, to start tearing the truth from the lie?
I'd start with, like, just because it's possible doesn't mean it's probable. We have to be really careful about, hey, of course this person could do this, but you have to have positive evidence towards that, and like a lack of evidence isn't help prove that case. If you can't, I think that's what these type of things are like. Okay, like Dr. Frank said, is this actually warranted? Is it possible? That's different than it's warranted to believe this. And I think we have to work really hard on, like, there has to be good evidence for something, not just an absence of, I think that's really important.
I think one of the things, like a lot of conspiracy theories are in some way focused around the government, right? Because the government has extra powers that there's a way to organize all of those sorts of things. And so one of the things I like to point out is, whenever I watched the fiasco that ensued by the way in which President Biden decided to withdraw troops from Afghanistan, and just the chaos that followed that, my immediate thought was, this is not a group of people that could coordinate a stolen election in 2020. And so I think it's really important just to and so there's sort of it gets phrased in different ways, but this notion that don't attribute to malice what can be explained by incompetence. And I think that actually helps whenever it reframes things, like, people who are on the more of the conservative side of things, like me, sit around complaining about the government can't do anything right. But then they turn around and say, but they're really good at all of these various conspiracy theories. And like, well, which is it? Are they incompetent or are they highly competent? Because, something like stealing an election involves a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of elements that have to go into that. And it would be really a sophisticated procedure. I don't have that much confidence that anybody in government could undertake such an effort. And so I think it helps us sort of reset our expectations. And it kind of builds on what Dr. Guerette was saying, that, that just because it could happen doesn't mean that it's likely it happened, right? Or just because you could conceive of a way that happened doesn't mean that people have the expertise or the ability to make it happen. And I kind of think it helps, just reset the levels, kind of do a bit of level setting there whenever how you're thinking through these things. And then lastly, I'll let to hear the others. I think there's for those of us who are like, whenever you look at the people on this call, right, we're either faculty members or university students. We are extremely privileged compared to so many in society. We've been given opportunities and abilities to be able to think carefully about these things. And I think with that becomes a real responsibility to our brothers and sisters in Christ who haven't been, they're busy working, or they're, whatever reasons they don't have the opportunity to have these kinds of discussions in a rigorous way, to get the training that we've had, that some of you are having now. And because of that, there's a real responsibility. And so the thing that I have sort of been struggling with on a kind of a personal level is the amount of easy acceptance of conspiracy theories that I've seen from people who I think should be more capable of resisting those things. And I think it actually leads people who don't have the opportunities that we have. They sort of will follow, like, well, so-and-so is really smart. He or she has this sort of a degree. And so I'm just going to go with what they say. And it's easy for that to happen. And so I think we do have a really high responsibility to be careful about how we assess these things, what we entertain, what we share, just as for a discussion on Facebook. Here's something I'm going to share. I think that can create an environment that maybe we're able to say, well, this is just kind of interesting, but maybe others don't have the training yet, or maybe they won't ever have the training to be able to entertain it in that sort of way. And so, so I just think in that process, whatever else it includes, I think part of it is going to be us taking more responsibility than just somebody who hasn't been through university and doesn't have this kind of training.
Right. Dr. Ross or Dr. Birch, what are some ways that you think people can be better prepared to navigate misinformation or potentially true information?
I'll dive in and give Dr. Birch a chance to think. A couple of things I've had in my mind as we've been talking, and I've been trying to figure out sort of how exactly I want to articulate this, but we talked a little bit about like how to know who to trust. For example, when we were thinking about like, is every priest now suspect, or everyone in the government now suspect, or whatever. And as Christians, I think one thing that can be helpful, this is maybe a heuristic if you're used to that language, a heuristic, not an algorithm, for my students who know what I'm talking about. But look for the fruit of the Spirit in the people you're choosing to trust. So that doesn't guarantee wisdom, but it is promising. And it does mean that they're going to have motives that you're going to be more wanting to align yourself with. So look for the fruit of the Spirit in the people that you trust. And then we have a tendency sometimes as Christians to want to know how a Christian should think on everything, and sort of have it all figured out. This is how a Christian should think on everything. And if you're wrong on any one of them, you're not a Christian. And that's not helpful thinking, and that's not how Jesus works. I mean, the guy on the cross beside him ended up in heaven, right? So it's not how Jesus works. So we know our salvation is in our relationship with Jesus, with our relationship with God. Yeah. And God has demonstrated his grace to us to the extent of sending his son to die for us. So he's definitely got enough grace for us if we're wrong on one of these things. So therefore, it's okay to allow yourself to consider the possibility that you might be wrong on one of these things. It doesn't, again, it's like separating it from your sense of identity. It doesn't make you not a Christian. If you have questions about this or that, or if you used to believe this and now you believe that. So recognize that there is so much grace, and your relationship, your security in your relationship with God is not threatened by these things at all. He is way bigger than any of this. So let that calm you down and reassure you as you face all of this.
Yeah.
Oh, amen. That was beautiful, Nancy.
Yeah.
I get pretty overwhelmed when I think about the worldwide knowledge base at everyone's fingertips. So I'm going to go to the microcosm of the classroom and a teacher and think about, what can a teacher do to prepare students well? And so I'm going to get my real $20 bill, which I dug out, and ask you, have you heard this? And do you think this is just like an internet, fake news story, or is it real? That when people are learning to identify counterfeit money, all they do is spend hours and hours with real money only. Actually, it is true. This is actually what happens.
Oh.
So if you are learning to identify a fake 20, you get real 20s. And what you do is you touch, you tilt, you look at, and you look through. And when you have done that so many times, when a fake comes along, it's like so obvious to you. So I'm going to use that to say, I think teachers should do more of providing actual lists to their students of websites and say, here are good sites. These are reliable. They're authentic. I have some expertise in this content. This is where you should go. Right. And we know that clicking on a site, that is only the very first step in understanding. There's still a lot of work for the student to do once they get there. So you're not doing your work for them, but what you're giving them is a chance to encounter a lot of authentic, really good information. So they sense what that feels like. And so then when they encounter something that's not, they might pick up on it. And then I just want to show, if it's okay.
Yeah, I think you have screen sharing permission. So
okay, I'll just share an anchor chart. So this is another thing a teacher can do, is to actually provide instruction and to talk about steps to do when you're looking at a source. And so we know an anchor chart is something that's on the wall. Students refer to it and they do the steps, and eventually they internalize this and it becomes automatic and part of what they do. But these are not intuitive things that everyone will need to know. Maybe because you're Tyndale students, you're in higher ed, maybe you have picked these up along the way. But I'm talking about younger students in K-12. They need actual modeling of how to do this and support for doing it. And some of the things that people mentioned are here. And in terms of the source and the mission, pulling up a website and saying together with a group of learners, okay, what is this site trying to do? Entertain us, influence us, inform us? What is the purpose? And then having discussions about how that can impact how we look at the site. And this is an anchor chart that's pretty good, and it's from library science. So library science is a field that is very invested in this question of how we look at information and what is true. And so that's a good place to look. And I just want to say one more thing, that, if a teacher gives a list of websites to their students, it's similar to, like, if you walked into a classroom, you might see bookshelves with books there, and the teacher has gathered those, collected them, they're developmentally appropriate, and the teacher says, use these to find out what you need to know. And it's similar to what your professor does when they create a syllabus. So they have the required readings are there, but do you notice the supplementary readings? And do you notice the bibliography at the end? That is the prof curating a bookshelf for you and saying, here is the good stuff. Here's a lot of stuff. If you go here, you're going to be good. And it's not to say, don't go anywhere else, but this is, types of information and sources you can use to judge other things you might run into.
That's really well stated, Dr. Birch. I appreciate what kind of came to mind was that kind of having a curator role that we could have. The thing I guess I would just add to that is, because, say faculty members or people who go off and become teachers, they can do that with their students. But I also think that Tyndale students can take that burden on themselves as well, for whenever they are at their church talking with somebody who's in their career. They don't have that. They can kind of do the same kind of thing. They can, and so it's part of that responsibility that I was mentioning earlier, that it's something that it's a service. Like, so we can serve our students, but our students have an opportunity that most people don't, and so they should take advantage of that opportunity, learn all that they can, and then turn and serve those in their community as well in a similar sort of way. And it kind of starts that starts things off on a better like footing or a better foundation. It's like you said, it's not, you can't go anywhere else, but it's a good starting point, and it's a good solid starting point that can help kind of prep you for those other sorts of sources and things like that. So yeah, that was really helpful. Thanks for that, Dr. Birch.
Yeah, I think it wasn't until I read Alvin Plantinga's How to Be a Christian Philosopher, but you could just as easily say How to Be a Christian Liberal Arts Student, that, you start seeing what you're learning and like these kinds of subtle skills that you're picking up, this toolbox that you're building as tools for ministry too. Because I think that's not a connection that's made immediately, at least for me. So that's really cool to see. And I also love that chart. I think we should have that up in a bunch of places, even for people who have already graduated grade 8 in high school, for sure.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we're going to be closing up soon, right?
Yeah.
But I'll add my bit of last bit of skepticism, just to throw a bit of balance in there. Not that anything you guys said wasn't amazing, but a family member once told me how, the evil one, or the Satan, Dr. Guerette Satan, his minions, they're clever, and they will always tempt us with things that look good, and we need to be mindful of those things as well. And just, lies and untruths are not always going to look like lies and untruths, and bad things are not always going to look like bad things. And that's where the difficulty comes in this whole exercise of seeking truth and critical thinking and our walk with Christ, because the Antichrist will come one day, and he's going to look like Christ maybe, and we need to be careful, and so that's when we just need to exercise that faith and caution and that healthy skepticism. But like everything you guys said as well, it's a balance. It's a delicate balance. It's the straight and narrow path, and maybe it's also the ladder of to heaven. I'm forgetting the author's name.
So sorry, I was just thinking as you were saying that how things look good to us, and sometimes, and this comes down to I don't know anybody that's come to accept a conspiracy theory that makes their side of things look bad. Right. And so it's always the other group that's done something terrible. And so sometimes what looks good to us are things that make the people in some other group look bad. And so I think should be cautious and careful about I think one of the things on the chart that we saw earlier was about, our biases. And so am I eager or overly willing to accept these sorts of claims because the people who I already dislike for various other reasons are made to look even worse? And I think it could just be something to be mindful of, that that we kind of fall, and I'm sure there's lots of explanations for why we do that Dr. Ross could give us as well. But it seems like that's just a common feature of these conspiracy theories is, if you're a hardcore Democrat, you're not going around talking about the conspiracy theories that make the Democrats look bad. You don't do that. And so you do it for the people on the other side of the aisle. So just kind of something to keep in mind, that what looks good, it can come in a variety of different guises of what makes it look good to us.
Yeah.
Very true.
Very good point.
Yeah. Does anybody have any last, comments or thoughts to add before we wrap up?
We didn't even get into whether angels are aliens or not.
Well, this has been an incredible conversation. Truly, I'm so grateful for all of you for taking the time out of your evenings to just share this information with all of us. I know that this is already, at least for me and probably many others, this is already becoming a resource that I'm going to look back to. And just as an encouragement for anybody who's feeling like, wow, that was a lot of information. This is something that we're always going to be practicing, I think, during our whole lives. And we're always going to be kind of teaching and learning. And as with anything, we're perpetual students, even after we graduate university. Yeah. So I just want to say thank you so much to you. And thank you so much to everybody who's watched this stream so far. Please continue the conversation in the comments and on campus, hopefully. And whenever you get the opportunity to bring it up in other conversations. Truly, this is something that hopefully will serve you guys in some way. Also, before you all go, please remember to keep up with all the Sophia Society news and events that's on our social media. We have an arts event coming up soon, so if you do visual arts or poetry or any kind of prose, even performance art, please consider submitting something. So all of that information is available. But until then, good night and thanks once again.
Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you, Rafael.
Thanks so much. This is great.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
It was fun.